Welcome to Minnesota Housing's 2018 Rental Housing Building Standards tutorial, which focuses on how to complete the Intended Methods worksheet. This training module will indicate where you can find the Intended Methods worksheet, explain the difference between the multifamily and single-family Intended Methods worksheets, review Minnesota Housing Sustainability Policy, demonstrate how to get started, provide project information, walk through instructions on the first page, explain how criteria will be implemented, explain how you might obtain optional points, walk through Minnesota overlay revisions, review the signature pages, and finally explain how to print, save, and submit the document. You can find the Intended Methods worksheet on Minnesota Housing's Building Standards webpage at www.mnhousing.gov. Click Multifamily Rental Partners, which can be found on the right side of the screen. Click the Building Standards section, which can be found under the Apply for Funding tab. Once on the Building Standards page, scroll down to the Sustainability section, where you will see two versions of the Intended Methods worksheet. One version is the multifamily version, another version is a single-family version. Chapter 2 of the Minnesota Overlay to Enterprise Green Communities criteria defines multifamily and single-family by funding source and not construction type. Note that all projects seeking or receiving funds through Minnesota Housing's Multifamily Division must use the multifamily version of the Intended Methods worksheet. The Intended Methods worksheet, or IMW, is not a standalone document. It is a tool to demonstrate compliance with our sustainability policy. To properly complete the Intended Methods worksheet, begin by reading the current version of the Enterprise Green Communities criteria. Then read the Minnesota Overlay and Guide to the Enterprise Green Communities criteria. The Minnesota Overlay adopts, clarifies, and revises certain aspects of the Enterprise Green Communities criteria to better align criteria with projects in Minnesota and to also align projects to Minnesota housing policies. Criteria items written in red text in the Intended Methods worksheet are those that have been revised through the Minnesota Overlay. Note that the Enterprise Green Communities is updated by Enterprise every 3 to 4 years. Minnesota Housing updates the Minnesota Overlay and the Intended Methods worksheet annually in April for our consolidated RFP. Download and choose Save As to save the Microsoft Excel Intended Methods worksheet. This form will be completed initially for the project application. This is the first of 3 submittal phases. It will also be updated and resubmitted for loan commitments, loan closing. And finally, it will be updated and resubmitted again at the end of construction closeout. Indicate the appropriate submittal phase by checking the applicable box. There are also 3 construction types: new construction, substantial gut rehab, and moderate rehab. The appropriate construction type must also be checked. The project information section on the top left of the first page must be accurate and updated with each submittal phase. Per the Minnesota Overlay, compliance with criteria 5.1, A, B, C, and D, a HERS Rater Energy Consultant is required. Indicate the individual and entity providing the service. Failure to identify this person or entity will be an automatic red flag for compliance. Remember to update the date last updated information for each submittal or resubmittal. Please carefully read all 7 steps of instructions on the first page. For new construction, projects must include all applicable mandatory criteria and at least 35 optional criteria points. For substantial gut rehab and moderate rehab, projects must include all applicable mandatory criteria and at least 30 optional criteria points. Note that the requirements for all mandatory and minimum optional criteria points are based upon whether the project is new construction, substantial gut rehab, or moderate rehab. Separate Intended Methods worksheets and certification forms must be provided for developments with scattered sites, different construction types, or a combination of low-rise and mid/high-rise buildings. Additionally, keep in mind that items written in red text are Minnesota Overlay items, which will be discussed later in the tutorial. For all mandatory criteria as well as selected optional criteria, the How Will Criteria Be Implemented column must be completed. And finally, the Intended Methods worksheet is formatted to be printed in a landscape or horizontal letter page format. All applicable mandatory criteria must have the How Will Criteria Be Implemented and Where in the Plan, Specifications, or Other Places Will Compliance Be Documented column completed. This is how we determine if the development team understands the criteria listed. Also, all applicable mandatory and all selected optional criteria must have the intent to comply section checked as yes. All other criteria must be checked either no, NA for not applicable, or WR, which stands for waiver request. Like mandatory criteria, all selected optional criteria must have the how will criteria be implemented and where in the plans, specifications, or other places will compliance be documented column completed. Again, this is how we determine if the development team understands the selected criteria. Also, like mandatory criteria, all selected optional criteria must have the intent to comply section checked as yes. Remember, this will be grayed out when these points are not available. All other criteria must be checked either no, NA for not applicable, or WR, which stands for waiver request. To reiterate, remember that all applicable mandatory criteria and all selected optional criteria must have the how will criteria be implemented and where in the plans, specifications, or other places will compliance be documented column completed. This is how Minnesota Housing staff determine if the development team understands the mandatory applicable or selected criteria. Again, all applicable mandatory and all selected optional criteria must have the intent to comply section checked as yes. Remember, this will be grayed out when these points are not available. And finally, all other criteria must be checked either no, NA for not applicable, or WR, which stands for waiver request. For optional criteria, points will be listed in both the MO column as well as the intent to comply column. The intent to comply column is shown on this slide. The number shown by the first arrow, which is 12, is the maximum available amount of points for the specified optional criteria. You have three options with the numbers listed in this column for each optional criteria. If seeking the optional points, you can choose the full amount listed. If seeking the optional points, you can also adjust the points lower, if seeking a lesser amount. If not choosing optional points, delete them from the intent to comply OP column. The points automatically subtotal for each of the categories and also automatically calculate for the final total at the end. If you are not taking the points, they must be deleted. Remember that if optional criteria points are not available, the OP column will be grayed out. Criteria items on the Intended Methods worksheet that are written in red text are those that have been revised through the Minnesota overlay. Please cross-reference the Minnesota overlay in conjunction with the Enterprise Green Communities criteria where you see red text. For criteria with black text, simply reference the Enterprise Green Communities criteria. As mentioned earlier, the Intended Methods worksheet will be submitted at each of three applicable phases. The phases are Phase 1, the initial application phase, Phase 2, the loan commitment closing phase for multifamily only, and Phase 3, the end of construction closeout phase. The initial application phase requires the name of the firm, organization, or company, the signature and type name of the borrower, developer, or owner, whichever applies, and the date. The initial application phase also requires the name of the firm, organization, or company of the architect of record, or the borrower's architect, the signature and type name of the architect of record, or the borrower's architect, and the date. Phase 2, or the loan commitment closing phase, includes all of the above, along with the general contractor information that includes the name of the firm, organization, or company, the general contractor's printed name and signature, and the date. The end of construction closeout phase, or Phase 3, requires the same information as Phase 2. Even though you completed this information at Phase 2, it must also be entered again at Phase 3, including new signatures and dates. Once you have completed the specific required sections and the document has been signed by the parties of each applicable phase, save the document in PDF format. The orientation or page layout should be landscape. The paper size should be regular letter size, which is 8.5 by 11. Upload and submit both the Excel document and the PDF save version to Minnesota Housing's online multifamily customer portal. Instructions on how to submit via the portal can be found on our website at www.mnhousing.gov. Finally, all criteria, both mandatory and selected optional criteria, must be incorporated into your project manual and specifications. If you want more information regarding this training module or have additional questions regarding how to complete the Intended Methods worksheet, contact one of Minnesota Housing's staff architects listed on this slide. Thank you for taking the time to view this tutorial.